Okay, we've made it to the last talk of our symposium. It's been a lot of work to get us here, and I'm super excited that it's gone off so well. I'll be talking today. Actually, we've been getting more and more parrot friendly as we've been going down the line here, and we'll end it out with this kind of our Naturalized Parrots Priority Invasive Species Warranting Control. This is another based on one of the chapters out of the upcoming book, Naturalized Parrots of the World by Stephen Pruitt-Jones. And as we know at this point, naturalized parrots are found all over the world. At least 47 species have naturalized populations. 2 of those species are very successful. We've had multiple presentations today on rose-ring parakeets and monk parakeets. And over time, various naturalized parrot populations have been targeted for control. We've heard about this in Hawaii for rose-ring parakeets, monk parakeets in parts of the US and Spain we heard about as well. Rainbow lorikeets in New Zealand, mixed parakeets in Hawaii and the USA as well. But as has been alluded to, a lot of times these eradication campaigns are very costly, they're unpopular, and they may not, and they usually don't eliminate the species that they're targeting. This is a good time to step back, and this is something I didn't know about until I started writing for this chapter. The Convention on Biological Diversity is the largest driver of control of naturalized species globally, period. It's a global treaty. 195 countries and the European Union are active participants. The USA's signed it but never ratified it, so this is the one exception pretty much. And it's the CBD that drives the creation of national level legislation on these naturalized species in the 196 signatories. It calls for members to identify priority invasive species and then specifically asks them to control or eradicate these priority invasive species. As a result, your member states are under pressure to identify and control the priority invasive species. However, species that are not deemed a priority, there's not really much pressure on. And that's why my talk has this rather odd title of, are they priority invasive species? Because that's really what matters in many countries. How large is the threat to biodiversity from naturalized species? We've had different speakers talk in very different voices about this, and that really reflects the competing views that are in the literature. There is the more traditional camp, and that naturalized species in general are super high impact, that they're the second most important threat to biodiversity, with only habitat loss being a greater threat. And as a result, pretty much all non-native species should be targets for removal. However, there is another side to this argument where some very high-profile authors are arguing that naturalized species have a much lower and more variable impact on native biodiversity. In these reports, very often they're talking that the reported impacts of naturalized species are backed up by very little scientific evidence, and that kind of naturalized species are an inevitable consequence of globalization, and what we really need to do is control only the invasive species with the largest negative impacts. Most of the previous reviews of naturalized parrots, those that have looked at continental or global scales, have really used this kind of high impact perspective. As a result, they've mixed up types of evidence. They'll put in confirmed impacts right next to probable and possible impacts, and they'll also include often the theoretically possible but unlikely impacts. As a result, these large-scale reviews often shows naturalized parrots as highly damaging and extremely negative. And it's these reviews that seem to be driving the national level dialogue for determining priority invasive status and then driving management and culling decisions. So we decided to do an impact analysis. We focused mostly on confirmed and probable impacts, looking at scientific publications and the gray literature. We reviewed probably over 250 articles. And I know we missed some, which is a problem, because if you're trying to if you're trying to show that something's not happening, you have to pretty much get all the references. But we looked at the ecological impacts. There are population level impacts on native species is what we really focused on. And we pretty much ignored any impacts where one individual of a native species was being impacted by other individuals of non-native species, but when these impacts didn't make it up to the level of altering population density. We compared documented impacts of naturalized parrots to those of all invasive species combined. So in the end, we kind of try and put this in a larger perspective and compare it to other naturalized species. We also looked at the economic impacts, which is really difficult because lots of people report them, but they're not actually quantified. So we tried to compile the quantified costs from naturalized species, and then we tried to, again, put those in comparison, put those in perspective by comparing them to other naturalized species. As has been mentioned repeatedly, naturalized parrots inhabit mostly urban areas, and this becomes important for my talk because this really reduces their interactions with threatened native species. It reduces their interactions with protected ecosystems. So we think that the ecological impacts are greatly lessened by the fact that most of these naturalized parrots are in urban areas. In our global review, we found a total of 3 clear cases of population impacts on native species. They were all by rose-ringed parakeets, impacting populations of giant noctule bats in Spain, which is a threatened species. They seem to slightly suppress urban European nuthatch populations in parts of Western Europe, but not all of Western Europe. And even though it's not really confirmed, I also include here, there's likely heavy competition and possibly spread of disease back and forth between rose-ringed parakeets and echo parakeets. But of all those other countries and all those other populations, we didn't find any other negative impacts of naturalized parrots on native populations. I'm sure some of the people in the audience may have additional ones, and I'd love to hear about them, but this is what we were able to find. If we put this in perspective, the IUCN Red List suggests that 1,312 species of birds and mammals are threatened by non-native species. We found impacts on 3 of species, only 2 of them were threatened species. That suggests that naturalized parrots threaten about 0.15% of the species that are threatened by invasives. Obviously not a very large impact. We also found surprisingly few economic impacts of naturalized parrots. For large-scale agriculture, the type that feed tens of thousands of people, it just wasn't recorded for naturalized parrot populations. The agricultural damage we did find was what we would call peri-urban agriculture. So most agriculture that was damaged was within 4 kilometers of a suburban area, of an urban area. And we found less than 10 confirmed cases in the literature. I'm sure there are more. But we found Spain, Israel, Florida, and Hawaii within the US. In addition, most of the losses were in the $3,000 to $15,000 range. There was an anecdotal report of $250,000 on dates in Israel, but it was just one line in a scientific paper, not really the subject of the paper. A bigger impact is easy to document with the electrical infrastructure damage by monk parakeet nests. They cause things to overheat and cause fires. It's relatively common in some parts of the United States, Florida, Connecticut, New York, Texas, and it can cost up to $1 million per year for the power companies to deal with this. Fortunately, this damage was not found in Spain, Israel, or Puerto Rico, areas where there have been intensive nesting studies, but just not found. We also found that some buildings have been chewed on in the UK. We saw Simons, which hasn't been estimated, chewing on buildings in Texas, and a few airplane collisions. If we put this into perspective now, naturalized parrots in the UK in around 2010 caused about $60,000 worth of damage. That is less than 0.005% of the total damage caused by invasive species in the UK in that year. If we look, rabbits, rats, deer, geese, and swans all do many orders of magnitude more damage to in the UK than naturalized parrots. Damage in the US is similar. The numbers aren't quite as clean, but it looks like 0.0013% of damage from naturalized species is caused by naturalized parrots. Stepping back, if we're to summarize this, naturalized parrots have their greatest impacts under very specific circumstances. If you have threatened species like the greater noctule bat that use cavities, and a large portion of those cavities are in urban areas, rose-ringed parakeets have the potential to cause some serious impacts. Again, the noctule bat being our only example so far, but I'm sure that this could be replicated in other areas. Another place that was really a cause for caution is where you have native parrots, especially native congeneric parrots. The opportunities for competition, for spread of disease, for competition over nest sites goes up, as happened with the Echo Parakeet and the rose-ringed parakeet. For economic damage, electrical infrastructure by Monk Parakeets is a serious problem, but fortunately it's geographically variable. So in many areas it might not be a big problem. Agriculture near urban areas, Monk Parakeets and rose-ringed parakeets seem to be possibilities for causing damage, as was talked about in Hawaii as well. But if you step outside of these specific circumstances, most naturalized parrot populations seem to have little or no significant impacts. This issue is complex. We worked very hard to summarize it, but it is a simplification. However, we really have to, and from this global view, suggest that most naturalized parrots are really not priority invasive species. And it's hard for us to agree with broad general statements like naturalized parakeets have begun to exert serious problems to native environment, wildlife, and humans. Instead, I think we're a lot closer to the perspective that Steve Pruitt-Jones said back in 2012. Naturalized parrots really have not lived up to the dire forecasts of large-scale environmental impacts that we were expecting. So, if we're looking at the possibility of, or the option of controlling naturalized parrots, it really looks at the ecological and economic impacts of naturalized parrots in general, maybe less than previously thought. And you really need to do a detailed and socially transparent cost-benefit analysis if you're going to consider these. You should think about what are the real ecological impacts, what are the costs of damage incurred versus the cost of eradication and control. Because if it's going to cost more to control these birds than it is to, than we'll save, but from the damage they do, it's hardly worthwhile. And what's the probability of success of actually eliminating or reducing damage? And then in the end, you have to factor in public opinion. If you look carefully, it may turn out that many of the control campaigns may not be warranted. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending our symposium. It was very well attended and we're very happy for that. And thank you